to say on the podcast, there's a lot of gender going on these days. Possibly too much gender. But however, I mean, it just does seem like it shapes our politics in pretty profound ways, for better and for worse. And so I thought I would have on someone who has spent quite a while now thinking, writing about gender in a particularly sharp and incisive way. So I'm very excited to welcome Jude Doyle, author of the forthcoming DILF. It's DILF. Trainwreck, Dead Blondes, Bad Mothers, numerous essays and articles on these and other subjects, and also some comic books, I believe. So multi-talented character here. So yeah, Jude, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
It's so lovely to be here. It's so lovely to talk to you.
Okay, so I mean, first question, tell me about DILF. What's that like?
It is a book that I entitled being like, I'm not going to take myself too seriously with this one. And I didn't realize that, like, not only I, but everyone else would have to say its name a lot for like a month. But anyway, it is a book. DILF, in this case, as we know, when there's a four-letter acronym that ends in F, the F stands for feminism. So it stands for Did I Leave Feminism? And it's sort of a book attempting to explain how extremely awkward it was after about, I want to say, 15 years as a public feminist under my dead name and my dead face and my dead gender identity to have to come out and like explain that I was a dude. And from there, this is just a really awkward moment to be both a trans person and a feminist right now because there's this horrific scourge of people misappropriating like 2000s Jezebel blog feminism to be really sassy about wanting to put trans people in camps. And it felt to me like younger trans people in particular were recoiling a bit from feminism out of earned distrust and thereby losing out on a really rich archive of ways to think about gender and power and the ways they connect. And feminism kind of has always been missing um, trans people. There have always been trans people within feminism, from like Polly Murray to Susan Stryker. We've always been here, but mainstream feminism was not incorporating trans insights on gender in an interesting way. And it was losing out for that. And it was, in some cases, being corroded into really horrific, hateful stuff that I don't think Shulamith Firestone, for instance, would have ever intended or wanted. You know? So it felt like when you are in an awkward position, when you're sort of wedged between two camps, which for whatever reason is a place I find myself a lot, you can either broaden that fracture or you can try to bring people together. And what I wanted to do was just explore the disjoint between trans and feminism as it exists today and try to weave some connections over that divide.
Yeah, I mean, like you, I have this feeling that feminism is in a bit of a it's in the wilderness, so to speak. That we've taken some pretty heavy hits in the political arena, and also, like, internally, it seems like at a bit of a crossroads,
Yes.
which I definitely want to ask you about, but I kind of want to ask you how we got here first and, like, what it was like getting here. So I guess my first question for you is, like, how did you become a feminist?
I mean, I became a feminist at what was a really good welcoming point. Like the early third wave, I think put a lot of emphasis on girls, on younger women, on punk ethos, on the idea that you didn't have to have like an advanced degree or know how to read Judith Butler in order to be a feminist. Like you needed to get involved and get in on the ground wherever you were and make your own stuff. And that ethos really followed me into the blog movement that came up in the early 2010s. I was a very late blogger. I started my first feminist blog in like 2008. But it that was, I think a really good moment for feminism. And it became pretty rapidly commodified. You know, it got to the point where feminism could mean basically anything anyone wanted it to mean, and it was being used to launch major brands. And I think that whenever something enters the mainstream culture in that way, it's easy to pick the broadest, dumbest, most commercial parts of it and say, oh, that's the whole movement. That's all it's worth. And people turned on feminism basically because they thought it was corny. When I was a, 15-year-old feminist, people thought I was trying to recreate the 70s or burn my bra or whatever. And like, to be clear, I would have loved that. I would have loved to set all of that on fire, but I was not able to at that time. But and by the late 2010s, feminism was just seen as this very shiny corporate Melissa Meyer lean in ethos that wasn't connected to radicalism and wasn't in particular connected to gender radicalism. Like I think that the if you look at like the work of like Andrea Long Chu that came out in you know, like what she was doing around 2016 through 2019 with females was like definitely appropriating some of the really ragged edges of the second wave, Solanas and Dworkin. But she was also like, she was referencing Paglia a lot. She was very like doing a lot of post feminism in her work. And that was the sense that like feminism had outlived its usefulness. It had become a tool of the ruling classes, and it wasn't connected to like real struggles for bodily autonomy, and it wasn't connected to radical politics in any meaningful way. And just it became really easy to lampoon it, to say that like feminism was like whatever Taylor Swift was doing, and if you wanted to do anything that genuinely changed the world, you would have to do something else. And then Roe versus Wade got overturned because everybody was looking in the wrong fucking direction, and it turned out that bodily autonomy actually was really fucking important, and we were all going to lose it. But that is another story. I think I have taken you like 3 miles away from your question.
No, I mean, I think that's a good perspective to start with. Um, and I mean, it feels like you're saying that there was this an inherent tension in the third wave, where on the one hand, like you said, you didn't need a doctoral degree. Like you could just get in and start doing stuff, and like you had a vague sense of like what feminism meant. But it's also precisely that incoherence, you might say, that made this stuff pretty easy to be co-opted, right? That,
Right.
oh, you can just like being a boss is feminism, and the liberation of people from patriarchy. That's a totally different question, right? That it just the diffuse ideology made it possible for a lot of different people to project different things onto the movement, for better and for worse. Is that kind of what you're getting at here?
Well, here's what I'm saying is that, like, yeah, expertise is traditionally sort of a patriarchal thing, right? You're not smart until some, like, ancient white man with 80,000 degrees decides that he wants to hear what you have to say, you know? And the ethos of the third wave was very much against that. It was about honoring your own lived experience. And this goes back to the second wave. It goes back to consciousness raising groups, right? The idea that if you got a bunch of women together in a room to talk about their experiences, patterns would show up and you would be able to tell what was personal and what was political and find out how connected they were. But when that hit the internet, when it became, sort of no longer something that it was just about like, yes, you can be a feminist. You, wherever you are already engaged in gender politics, and you deserve to analyze the gender politics you're working within and see if they actually suit you or serve you or your values, right? That's basic. That's the basic third wave thing. And there was a lot of emphasis. Bitch magazine, for instance, was specifically a feminist response to pop culture, because pop songs and movies and TV, that's often where we encounter gender politics played out in the broader world. Um, but when that became a sort of a consumer good, when it became an aesthetic, when it became a trend, it was easy to trivialize, and it was easy to divorce it from its roots in a deeply egalitarian politics of giving everyone, no matter their class background, no matter their educational background, equal access to deciding the future of the feminist movement. And to become just like, you know, feminist is listening to top 40 pop because some of the singers are women. Feminist is having your own workspace that you pay like $1,000 a month for that isn't very good to its female employees. Feminist is an ethos and a trend and an aesthetic, but it's no longer really connected to a politic. It's just sort of anything a woman does if she does it with sufficient amount of sass.
Branding.
Yeah, exactly. And that I think is that because third wave feminism focused so much on being easy and accessible and friendly and egalitarian, non-hierarchical, at least in terms of who could claim expertise, that it was ultimately really easy for it to be co-opted. And I think I'm stealing a lot here from a really great feminist and the founder of Bitch Magazine, Andy Zeisler, who wrote a book called We Were Feminists Once, which is all about this, you know? But I think ultimately, when you, to connect this back to trans politics, when you get to that place where it's just like feminist is anything a woman does. If I'm a woman and I want to do it, then it's a feminist thing to do. That leads to gender essentialism. It leads to sort of this idea that woman is this special protected category, that's the only axis of gender marginalization we're really interested in. And ultimately it leads you to these really weird threads on Mumsnet where it's like giving birth is a thing that a woman can do. I'm doing the thing women do, and other people are trying to take this away from me somehow. Like it leads to ultimately essentializing womanhood and bringing in grotesque misrepresentations of second wave thought and deeply alarming biological essentialism and basically the ideal of woman as constructed by TERFs isn't, like half the planet. It is a very specific Victorian conception of white femininity that needs to be protected by a strong man and is continually under assault by the rest of the world, up to and including any woman of a lower or more marginalized class. So that's, I think, that when you lose your roots and you lose your politics and you lose your actual grounding in the theory, it's really easy for feminism to become a word we just fling around for anything and everything, up to and including some really horrific bigotry.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that story I agree with. There are some things I might frame a little differently. So I'll
Yeah.
tell you a story. You tell me what you think about it.
Okay.
Which is that for me, the third wave was very much defined by its embrace of intersectionality.
Hmm.
Um, right? And I think, and like an explicit, like this was supposed to be like the thing that was different from the second wave. The
Yeah.
second wave wasn't intersectional, it was essentialist. We are going to be intersectional. We are going to recognize the way that all these other axes of oppression create different forms of misogyny, different women's experiences. We're not going to be essentialist. And I think in some ways that was very valuable. That's a very valuable corrective. I think like intersectionality is just like correct. Like let's just start there. Um, but I think also from the perspective of a movement, one of the things that intersectionality did, like as a movement, as a research program, is it let you not do theory, right?
Mm.
Because we're not going to have a theory of what is patriarchy. We don't need a theory of what is patriarchy. I can just focus on my little piece of my own very specific intersectional oppression, and I can describe that in great detail, and it can be very illuminating.
Yeah.
But that meant that I didn't actually have to fight with anybody else who might have different ideas about what the big theory is, and it kind of like let us all get along in a certain way without raising any differences we might have. And I think that worked for a while to sort of keep the peace among different people calling themselves feminists, but that ultimately it left a vacuum, left a void where you do in fact need theory, where these theoretical disputes do kind of matter. And it let, like you say, left space for this more biological essentialist, you know, turfy version of feminism to come back and say, actually, we have a theory, right? We have
Yes.
answers to
Yeah.
these questions that you have. We can tell you what is patriarchy actually, and why should you fight against it.
Well, speaking of theory, like, first of all, I push back actually against the idea that the second wave was always essentialist. I don't know if you're talking about like biologically essentialist, but like Shulamith Firestone was very anti biological essentialism. Like, she essentially said that like she did not care how much of gender came from nature. She didn't care because she didn't care about nature. We cook our food, we poop in indoor toilets, we can change our genders if we want to. That's fine. You know? Or, like Polly Murray laid the foundations for intersectionality. And Polly Murray is very much a second wave feminist. They like founded Now, for God's sakes, and immediately got kicked out of Now for like trying to redirect it toward the struggles of Black and poor women, but whatever. But what I will say is that, yeah, I agree with you. The theory on this, the theory on the third wave start where you are thing is one that I can sort of trace very pretentiously from bell hooks back to Paulo Freire, back to Gramsci. It's the idea of the organic intellectual, right? People don't need to be taught, Freire would tell you, and Hooks would tell you, citing Freire, they need to be given the critical tools to analyze their actual conditions on the ground. They don't need to have knowledge dumped into their heads by an authority. They need to be taught how to think, and then they will be able to work on what they're working on. And that's true. I still believe that's true. But I also believe that if you individualize it and turn it into sort of like an internet role playing game where like I'm doing my feminism by proving I'm more feminist than this other person on the internet. Like it's very easy to end up with a calculus that says feminist is what makes me comfortable and makes me happy, and unfeminist is what makes me uncomfortable and makes me unhappy. And you're not connected into any broader struggle by that. You're ultimately just a player in the role playing game. You're trying to arrange the conditions so that you win. And like obviously, that makes it really easy. I don't think intersectionality is to blame for this. I think, human nature and the fact of social competition and ingrained bias is responsible for this. It makes it really easy for somebody to concoct some kind of cracked second wave ish theory and market that as like, I understand what patriarchy is. It's when I have uterus and you don't. Like it it's you know, the backwash that comes from framing everything around yourself and not having, as you say, a broader struggle and a broader framework, talking about like the power structure of patriarchy and the reason that patriarchy, rests on denying people their bodily autonomy. Starting there with like a core understanding of what feminism exists to oppose, which is patriarchy and gender marginalization, gets you to a place that is a lot smarter than just like feminism is when I get what I want.
Yeah, I mean, I will always go to bat for reading the great books.
Yeah.
In this case, if I happen to think one of those great books is The Dialectic of Sex, right? And that just comes from my own like personal life. I'm pretty smart. I can do critical thinking, but like I would never understand the world as well just like sitting in my own little cave and thinking really hard as if I engaged with other people who have thought about this stuff and have like really put in the work to say something, to stand on the shoulders of giants in the old phrase. Um, but that's just me being a pedant. I guess what I want to ask you is, in all the story that we've been telling about the third wave and like where it went wrong and blah blah blah, where is Me Too in all of this?
I think Me Too was the culmination of an incredible amount of work that had been done to change the culture. I mean, I can't say enough. Like, when I started blogging about rape and rape culture in 2008, I would routinely, like just routinely on a regular basis, get guys who were really upset with the idea that an unconscious person couldn't give consent. Like, they're like, well, how am I supposed to be sexy and wake up my girlfriend by having sex with her unconscious body? Like, I would advise that you don't do that, sir. I would say no. But it was so endemic in the culture just even 10 years before Me Too that you blamed rape victims. You talked about what they were wearing. If a 12-year-old girl got raped, it was okay to call her precocious and say how often she hung around with older boys in the news, in the newspaper. You didn't have a clear understanding that affirmative consent was, the presence of a yes and not the absence of a no. And when you tried to talk about that, people would make weird SNL or Dave Chappelle skits about it, about like, oh, you want me to sign a contract before sex? Like it was weird and alien that you should be having sex with a person who looks and acts like they're enjoying themselves. Like Me Too came out of so much work that had been done. And this is where the third wave of like really media friendly feminism actually did pay off. That like there was so much work done to change our assumptions around sex. And then finally, somebody figured out, this one of those reporters has since gone on to be a TERF, but like give the Harvey Weinstein story its due. They figured out how you could actually correlate and come up with a responsible reporting standard for a sexual assault case in the absence of like being there in the room when someone was sexually assaulted. And then after being told over and over and over and over and over what you've been told is not is normal sex is not okay, what you've been told is normal sex is not safe, you should not be left feeling hurt and wounded and degraded and traumatized after a normal sexual encounter. Finally, everybody was able to say, oh, that's right, me too, right? And obviously, like, the culture cracked down on that really, really hard, because what Me Too actually started doing was not just naming and shaming individual offenders, but actually questioning the framework of like what we've been doing as a culture and what we've been teaching, you know, normal heterosexual couples to inflict upon each other, you know. Well, one half tends to inflict more than the other, but um
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all right, and I think this gets to some of the ways that I mean, I still think the third wave is very valuable. I mean, like you look at what it was like in the '90s,
yeah,
right? And that it was an incredible job of kind of excavating the endurance of patriarchy, of sexism, of misogyny, like pointing out like how pervasive rape culture and just rape were in our world in a way that we had kind of brushed under the table for too long. Um, right, and like actually making a movement out of it. I think that was all incredibly valuable. Um, and yet here we are.
yeah, like that's the thing, is that like the amount of progress, I think when I was in college, like the erotic sensation that swept the nation was like Girls Gone Wild, which was really specifically like, we've gotten these very young women incredibly wasted, and we're going to film them doing things and sell it to you. Are they sober enough to sign a contract? No, but that's fine. And that was just like, it was completely normalized. And nobody, if you said you had a problem with it, people would look at you like you were Andrea Dworkin and you were like coming at them with a machete, you know? But it, to get from there to Me Too in like 10 years is incredible progress. But any progress that moves that fast gets cracked down on. And I think that's exactly what happened. That like people could sense that the norms on gender actually were shifting really rapidly. And the norms on gendered violence in particular were shifting very rapidly. And no differently than like the trans tipping point almost immediately leading to like J.K. Rowling and, the reintroduction of bathroom bans and healthcare bans and, the terrible reign of Jesse Single or whatever. Like shifting the norms on gender violence and misogyny that fast brought out literally everyone whose sense of themselves and their masculinity and their power was based on being horrifically violent to women, to renormalize it again. I think the day we're recording this, I really try not to like remember anything the president says, because I feel like having those words in my brain is like summoning a demon. But he just gave a speech going like, oh, we've been calling the wrong things crime. Nowadays, if a husband and a wife have a fight, they say it's a crime. Like, like we're really on like a very overt restoration of the patriarchy tip right now as a culture.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely the MAGA project.
Yeah.
Um, just no question about that. And I kind of want to come back to MAGA, what this reaction that we're living through and fighting against. But I also want to ask you about you. So, like you said at the outset, you spent a long time in, the women's movement, as a professional, fighter for women's rights. And then after a certain point, you had to come out and be like, actually, sorry, guys. Um, some mistakes are made. Um, so I'm curious, like what that was like, and I guess how it's changed your perspective on feminism and all these things we've been talking about with the third wave.
Yeah, like there's this really like common meme of like the traditional trans mask pipeline, which is going from I'm not like other girls to I'm not like other girls because I'm not a girl to I'm a man to I'm not like other men. Like it just you almost immediately need to separate yourself from whatever's going on there. But it's it is scary. And like when I realized that he pronouns were coming down the pike, like that was a big thing because I, like everyone else in the culture, had been taught to identify manhood pretty exclusively with holding a dominant position within patriarchy, with punching down, with exercising violent and coercive power over others. And, I think a lot of people were confused because they tried to overlay that concept onto me and it didn't necessarily, like any guy who tries too hard to like tell you he's a feminist like right away, it doesn't sound like he's a great feminist. It sounds like he's like probably like Neil Gaiman or something, right? Like it sounds like there's something going on there. But you know, it was also hard for me to understand how I could be myself and have the values I held and still identify as a man. It was hard. Um but what it did for me was to force me to really clarify a lot of concepts and words I had been using in sort of a half-assed, lazy way, and to clarify, like, what exactly is my investment in the feminist project? Is it bodily autonomy? Sure. Is it the fact that I have experienced, like, frankly, given my position as a very public person whose like job was to be a woman and have opinion about women things, I find it hard to say that what I faced was not misogyny. Like when there's like a whole blog post where a bunch of dudes are like rating your fuckability as compared to all your other female peers in the field, you're like, I don't know, is this misandry? Is it man hatred happening to me right now? Like I don't think it is, but it and it forced me to think about like does man necessarily always mean occupying the victor slot in patriarchy? And of course it doesn't for a lot of cis men. I don't think that gay cis men who get read as gay really easily are given the exact same gendered treatment as like straight passing gay men or as very burly traditionally masked cis men. I don't think that masculinity means the same thing in a man of color, where it's going to be used to cast him as a threat and a monster, that it does in a white man, where it's going to be used to cast him as a natural leader. Um, it's it's important to actually break down what we're saying and what our actual struggles are, what our actual investments in patriarchy are, and how we interact with it, rather than assuming that like man means one thing and woman means the other thing and man is this and therefore woman is that and they're complete opposites and they always will be and that will never change. Like that does not lead you back into an understanding of patriarchy. That just leads you back into the patriarchal gender binary, and it leads you back into essentialism, and it therefore leads you back into transphobia and sexism and all the other awful things in the world.
No, I think that's exactly right. There's a kind of feminism that I find very frustrating, where it sort of assumes that misogyny is like this field that like of oppression that goes from all men to all women in the same way, and like we can spend all this time like arguing about like is this misogyny or is this misandry or is like, and we just get tied up in knots for kind of some of the reasons that you were talking about. But it's more useful for me anyways to see patriarchy as like there's a structure to it.
Yeah.
Right. It is not as simple as all men against all women, but it's this biopolitical vision of the world as like structured by reproduction. And like that means like there's a structure in the family, but there's also a structure like between families and between peoples. So it's always kind of tied up with race and class in certain kinds
Mhm.
of ways. Those are both like also core components of this biopolitical vision, right? There's a reason that the racists are all misogynists, right? There's a reason that the authoritarians are all racist. It's like there's this package of ideas that always goes together and isn't really separable because it is just one vision of this hierarchical structure of society that is, I don't know, based on biological reproduction and like a zero sum mindset. To me, sorry, that's
Yeah.
now I'm just ranting, but I think that's
I would add to that that patriarchy is also a set of values, right? Like the reason it matters, the reason we have all of these exhausting arguments about like whether capitalism matters more than patriarchy or whether patriarchy predates capitalism and therefore couldn't have been constructed by, it gets really exhausting and people hold on to their viewpoints really fiercely. But one reason it matters to point to the fact that patriarchy does predate capitalism is that patriarchy and the nuclear family is actually where we learn dominance politics. It's where we learn that all our most intimate relations are structured on one person on top and the other people beneath. And the one person has the power to inflict violence and coercive authority on the ones beneath them. And capitalism is not, somehow not a problem because patriarchy is older. Capitalism is, in fact, a problem because it's built to work like patriarchy, right? It's built to work like somebody's on top and everybody else gets shit on. And until we unravel the dominance politics in our most intimate and earliest relationships, we stand a very poor chance of being able to unravel and oppose dominance politics in the larger systems that surround us, right?
so. I
Mm.
am probably more of a capitalism defender than most people on the internet these days,
Well,
but I do absolutely agree with the point about I mean, the personal is political, right? That the family is the model for the state in the authoritarian mindset, and like we can see it because they'll just tell you these days, right?
yes.
You know, Mel
No, all
Gibson will
the
like
daddy
what's
stuff is.
yeah, it's like daddy's home and he's taking off his belt, right? That is like his understanding of like how running a nation works.
I know, like, you could read all of Sylvia Federici, or you could just read that tweet about Daddy Trump taking off his belt, and you'd be like, "Oh, I get it. I get it now." Like, it's it's so disturbing. And it really is like the idea that the nuclear white family is supposedly just like transcends history, like has always existed. Like there were monkeys, and then one monkey picked up a stick and learned to use it as a tool, and the next day was the set of Father Knows Best. Like that's the rate of human evolution, So like that gender schema and family schema has always been with us, and it's what authority looks like. And we have gone astray as a culture because we've allowed ourselves to think that authority can be structured in different ways. We've allowed the kids to get the run of the house. We've allowed mom to get lazy and, spend all her time reading instead of vacuuming and making us dinner. It's really
So
it's dismal. And until we like actually look at patriarchy in the face and realize how fucking foundational it is to this moment, we are not going to be able to move any of it, the white supremacy, the transphobia, any of it, until we recognize that it is based on a restoration of patriarchy and biological essentialism.
So I kind of want to press you on this a little bit,
Okay.
um, because so there's definitely there's this conservative strain that says okay, well, modernity, all this gender equality stuff we've been trying, that's a deviation from what's natural, and
Mhm.
what's natural is patriarchy, and back on the savannah, men were men and women were women and blah 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 blah. And what's interesting to me is that at least some feminists have kind of accepted the premise of the argument in the
Mm,
sense to say, okay, well, you say patriarchy is natural. Now I have to prove that it isn't natural. And to do that, I need to prove that back on the savannah, we had primitive communism and gender equality, right? That, I also have to get into all this stuff about history and prehistory, even, and make these arguments about how, I mean, this is kind of how people wind up with the view that patriarchy was invented by capitalism, because they need patriarchy to be the modern deviation from the natural state of gender equality.
yeah.
I think Amia Srinivasan in her book, The Right to Sex, basically just says this directly, that she wants to prove that patriarchy isn't natural. And anyways,
Yeah.
and I also find that uh, very frustrating, um,
Mhm.
because I think it leads people to, well, they know what they need out of history, and so it leads people to distort history a little bit. Because I agree with you, right? The white Victorian ideal of the family, that's very unique, that's very modern. But patriarchy isn't particularly modern, right? Family structures vary a lot over the world, over culture, over history, but there is a lot of patriarchy out there, right? It didn't all come on the boats with the Europeans, um, and so that's kind of a dismaying fact that I think we have to deal with, which is kind of why, again, to come back to Firestone, I always really liked the Firestone analysis, right? Which is that, yeah, the world we live in, it is defined by these sex classes that are structured by their reproductive role, and that's bad. And who cares what happened in prehistory? We want to change it. We want to do
Yeah.
something different in the future, right? And the natural doesn't even, like you were saying, the natural doesn't really matter to her. It's what we can do with it that
Yeah.
matters.
Yeah. And I absolutely like, I think that Firestone's analysis is a really potent one, and it's kind of the final answer, which is like, who cares whether it's natural or not natural? We can do whatever we want now. We have vaccines, we have toilets, we have cooked food, we have feminism. But I do think, and this is a conversation I've been having a lot actually, talking about this book, because there is sort of a section on it that's like there have been different gender arrangements throughout history and in different places. I think that looking at the actual historical record and looking at the different ways gender has been understood in different places. I talk about the white patriarchal Christian gender binary not to be like trendy and not to be quote unquote woke, but just because that's the gender system I've been raised with, right? Like that's the one I actually understand. Um, but I think it is important to note that there is no one natural way of doing gender that all humans have always done everywhere. The very 70s project of like trying to find a universal goddess civilization where like it was a matriarchy and we were all happy and perfectly peaceful and like the I cannot
And then
say
the Fire Nation attacked.
yeah, and then the Fire Nation attacked. But yes, like essentially a lot of feminist theory was like gender avatar for a long time, and that's not a useful analysis. It's not based on a lot of archaeological reality, but neither is the idea that like God created man and gave unto him his wife to conquer and she should submit to him, right? Like that's also invented and that's also not universal. And it's a code of behavior and ideology that has been adopted and taught and exported over history. It's important for us to know that we don't have a natural state, is what I would say. Like the last time we were in a natural state, we weren't people, we were monkeys. And we probably threw poop at each other to settle our arguments. And I don't plan on going back there anytime soon. We'd rather figure out what we can do right now.
No, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, yeah, it's just hard to look at history and, like, honestly, and not see this incredible diversity. I think some people are so desperate to look at history and like they need to see their own politics reflected back at them
Yeah.
because they'd be afraid to just say, to stand on their own feet and say, like, this is what I believe in, this is the world that I'm fighting for. I don't care if it's natural, that's not the question. right? But some people are like, they can't bear the thought of that kind of moral responsibility. And so they feel the need to like imagine a past that comports with what they want the past to be.
Right. Yeah. And, like,
So
that's I understand that. It's very like, arguing from the natural is always such a seductive thing because it means, "I can't help it, that's the way it's been, that's the way it's always gonna be, I've been fooling myself." We do that to ourselves with all sorts of narratives, but the reality is that we are people who have agency in the present day. We are part of the unfolding continuum of time, unfortunately, and,
for better and for worse.
yeah. It's just arguing from the natural, I think, ultimately leads you back to kind of a bad reductive place that is deeply fatalistic and says that what was is what will always be. And there's no freedom to be found there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see at least some turfs kind of taking that trajectory of, okay, well, I have to figure out what's natural, and it leads to this kind of bio-pessimism where it's
Yeah.
like, oh, men are like this biologically, and women are like this biologically, and I'm on the side of women, but like the best we can do is like, you crank through it 5 times, and it's like, oh, it's the patriarchal bargain. Right. It's
Yeah.
like men are violent and dangerous, and we need to bargain with them to get the best kind of protection that we can for like our virtue as against those dangerous other men who are attacking our virtue and like blah blah blah.
Yeah. The only way to stop a bad guy with a penis is a good guy with a penis. Yeah, like that
That's
kind of.
that's what I was taught to believe as a child.
And it's deeply, just it's really depressing. And when I was reporting on TERFs and their increasing links with the far right, like there are white articles in white supremacist magazines, at least one that's like, look, they already believe in one unfixable biological hierarchy. And they already agree that men are by nature violent brutes and that the best they can do is get protection from one so that none of the others can get to them. And guess what we can convince them of now? It's that the violent brutes are all people of color and white men are on their side. And like, it's just so easy to like move someone straight from patriarchy to white supremacy. And the Nazis know it, and the TERFs somehow don't know it. But we should all know it too, you know?
No, I think that's exactly right. And I mean, we can just see this playing out with like how readily like Trump and MAGA are like willing to adopt turf rhetoric in order to support their agenda. When it comes to attacks on trans people, for instance, which I don't know. Obviously, it's very important, but I kind of don't want to talk about it because it's too depressing. So I'm going to ask you a different question, which is if this is what we're up against, if this is the kind of state that our feminism is in right now, how do we start putting feminism back together? Right? What should we be fighting for?
I think what makes sense to me is a coalitional politics based on our actual experiences and needs, right? Every human being needs and deserves control of their own body. Second wave feminism gave us that. Crusty, rusty old second wave feminism gave us the concept of bodily autonomy. And when we look at that, we can realize that, and I mean, this is one of the weird insights I've gained from coming out is that, like, no, I'm not a woman, but as long as women are treated like shit, I always will be. Like as long as I'm even vaguely linked to that class or somebody can find out that I was once linked to it, I'm always going to be vulnerable to that. And as much as I don't want to be like a kumbaya, we're all in this together thing, I think if we get past posturing and labels and, performative feminism towards looking at where our actual vulnerabilities are, what our actual needs are, and how the culture is working to deny them to us, you do begin to realize that I'm not safe until you're safe, and you're not safe until I'm safe. And therefore, it is in my absolute best interest as, and again, I'm very much like a hyperfixator on gender. I'm a feminist and my politics center on feminism, and that's always just what they do. But at least among gender marginalized people, I think that we are natural allies to each other, and that a tremendous amount of work is done to split us apart from each other, not just, say, cis women and all trans people, but the endless like trans femme versus trans masc discourse that just pops up like a fucking weasel in a pop the weasel game every 5 minutes online. Um, the endless discussion of like whether people who transition medically and non-binary people who don't transition medically, or any trans people who don't transition medically, are really the same kind of trans, and whether one person isn't actually more serious than another and therefore more deserving of help and aid. Like, there's so much work put into fracturing and breaking down any potential coalition between gender marginalized people. And I think that is because if you actually put us all together, we are the one group that touches every other group in existence. Every income strata, every culture has gender marginalized people within it. And we could potentially move the world if we could just get that lever working.
I mean, I think that's historically been one of the big strengths of like the queer movement, right? Is that we're kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
And like just coming out being like normal people, like who aren't predators here to turn your kids into, degenerates or whatever, just has been a very, very effective strategy. Um, but I kind of want to come back to what you said at the beginning here about how the fight should be for bodily autonomy, which I think is an interesting emphasis, right? Because again, you see, I hate to pick on her, but I just read her book, and so it's kind of still in my head. Amy Srinivasan's The Right to Sex, where she says radical feminism is basically the belief that there's a sharp distinction between sex and gender is a pure social construct, and sex is biological, bodily, yada yada, and that all the oppression that we're interested in is on the gender side. And to me, this seems like it has the implication that, like, well, we don't really need to change bodies. What we need to change is the perception of bodies, right?
Hmm.
We need to change the values we put on bodies. But we don't actually need to change the bodies themselves. That's just, the raw material for the project. And again, what do you think about that line of
Yeah.
hers?
That's like the gender was always already, or sex was always already gender, sort of the reading of Judith Butler, that like our body parts aren't our gender, they are just read as being a gender by patriarchy. And that's the thing, is that like there's such a diversity of trans experiences around like how you experience your body parts as gendered, that I just don't think it is ultimately in my best interest or anyone else's best interest to try to come up with some total formulation around like, no, you must change your body parts or you are not trans, or like you must experience dysphoria with this and this. That was always such a hurdle for me,
Oh my God.
coming out, because like I don't know, I don't spend any time in my body. How would I know what's uncomfortable in there? I spend all of my time ignoring it. I am just out of there most of the time. You know, so it just, I think, for me, basic decency always pretty much requires taking people at their word, and taking people at their word that like their experience of gender or their experience of their body is what they say it is. And that's why I think a politics of bodily autonomy and self-determination that doesn't rest on like trying to say that you must relate to or live in your body or your gender in one specific way in order to be truly feminist, or to be truly trans or to be truly queer or whatever. Um, that ultimately is going to leave people with the breathing room they need to find their own paths and find what works for them. And, I don't need to know how you're trans. I don't need to know why you're trans. What I know is that an assigned gender that somebody laid on you at birth after looking at you for 2 seconds should not determine your opportunities, should not determine your entire future, should not determine every relationship you ever had, and that you should be the one determining those things and determining how you choose to move through the world. I think according people's sovereignty over their own bodies and lives is ultimately the only respectful way to go about it.
I mean, I agree with that. Right? I find these debates over like which identity is the right identity like very tedious. Like again, on a personal level, like this, I had like when I was trying to figure out who I was, like I kind of had like imbibed this mental model of like to be trans, you need to have exactly this relationship to your body and your gender, and I didn't have it, and like it screwed me up for a long time.
Yes.
So I really reject that politics. I really like the idea that, like, your gender is your business to figure out. What we should be caring about is, like, do you have sovereignty over your own body, the ability to make that body and that life what you want it to be? I really believe in that. And I think, but I also want to play devil's advocate for a moment.
Oh
Uh,
no. Okay.
yeah, sorry. Professional hazard. Um, which is something you said earlier, right? That patriarchy, it's not just, a material structure, but it's a set of values, right? And one of the big complaints that we were talking about with the third wave was this idea, well, anything I do is feminist because I'm a woman,
Yeah.
right? Right. And like a lot of people have objected to that, say, well, that's not true. Like you can be enacting patriarchy through your values, through your choices. Like not every choice is a feminist choice. Like, how does that connect with the idea that we should kind of set aside those questions and just focus on bodily autonomy?
I mean, I think that it's, as always, a question of like weights and balances. Like, ultimately, the way I fuck in my own personal bedroom is not going to uphold or destroy the patriarchy. And something like the sex wars, where there was just like endless, sort of trying to form some sort of code of conduct for how feminists were allowed to have sex. Like, it was such a blind alley, and it led us down such a bad path, and it was exhausting and it was useless. But, like, I choose my choice, and I choose to be a wife and a homemaker, and moreover, I choose to have a YouTube channel where I talk about how being a trad wife is what all women secretly want. Like, that doesn't work either, right? You have your choices, but you also have impact on others around you. You have the ability to uphold or to resist the greater social structures. And I think that giving you freedom to decide whether you want body hair or a flat chest is not the same as giving you freedom to decide whether you want, camps for people to go in when you don't like them. Right? Like, we have a social contract, and we have an obligation to, as feminists, be public educators and make sure people understand the nature of the patriarchy and the nature of the system they live within. And as actors, we have the obligation to not uphold the most regressive, worst parts of patriarchy just because they give us a temporary power advantage, or they suit us, or they feel nice, or whatever.
Okay, I think that's plausible enough. Um, Bodily autonomy is a good ideal in practice or in theory, in the abstract. How would we implement that, right? If, how would a blue state, blue city, or maybe a future democratic, federal government, like what kind of laws are we talking about here?
Okay, I am admittedly weak on policy. Like, every time I've tried to talk about electoral politics, people have beaten me into the ground because they don't know what I'm talking about. But it, I think, would entail things like not passing laws that get in between people and their doctors on the private medical choices they're allowed to make. I think we can say that for a certainty. It would mean making resources on gender and sexual and reproductive health available so that people are not only making choices, they're making informed choices. Um, it would entail teaching very basic things like consent from a very early age, because it starts at a very early age. He's touching you because he likes you, like that gets bred in the bone, and you have to do conscious work as a parent or an educator to oppose it. um, it would entail giving children respect as full human beings with bodily autonomy, with limited context and limited knowledge, but there are plenty of adults that have limited context and limited knowledge too, and that doesn't make them any less human, you know? So not treating children as property, and not in particular treating their bodies as property that can be ultimately controlled by their parents. I think that's a very good place to start. Um, I think that's what I've got for you, is that, like, when we start from respect for people's dignity and self-determination, we learn not to touch them or keep them from making decisions that affect their futures, you know.
Yeah, so I think on the adult side, respect for bodily autonomy, not like you said, access to healthcare, whether that's abortion care, transition care, um, right, on an informed consent model. That's one thing that I think is pretty straightforward. Obviously, kids have become an extremely hot button issue,
Mhm.
um, right? And I had Talia Levin on the podcast earlier, and she talked about like just the total disregard of children's rights that we have in this country, and possibly the need for a children like a movement for children's rights. Um, but at the same time, right, children aren't adults. We don't give them all of the rights of an adult, right? Children can't drink alcohol. They can't
Right.
join the military. They can't, sign certain kinds of contracts, right? Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. They can't vote. There's a lot of stuff that we don't, at the moment, allow children to do.
Right,
So
exactly. Like,
where,
no reason, like, children's rights says that children are full humans, so there's no reason they can't be sent to work in my sweatshop. Like, that's clearly not where we're heading with this,
right?
right? Like, children have rights which include protection from an adult who genuinely has their best interests in mind. Hopefully more than one adult, Jesus Christ. But it, you know, and it's a balance I work with as a parent, pretty thoughtfully, that I try to give my daughter full context for her decisions, and I try to let her have as much agency as possible. But also, like, you know, she can't not get vaccines because she doesn't like to get shots, right? Like, that's a case where I am capable of doing the risk benefit analysis, and I can't let her make that call because I can't let her get sick and die, right? Um, So, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people who argue for children as somehow small adults who should be given like a full set of adult decisions to make right away, either those people have never met children and they don't know how distressing and like deeply upsetting and sad that would be for a kid to have to make all the same decisions an adult makes every day, or they're just like creeps. Like they're just like, you're 5 seconds away from like hearing the Nambla pitch with that one. But I think that we can respect that children are literally like people whose brains are growing every day and are not done growing, and who have almost no context for the world and very little, ability for emotional self-management, and who need to be treated with kindness and respect desperately. But, you know, that doesn't mean like the fact that my kid has a hard time calming down when she gets upset does not mean that like I am entitled to tell her who to be or what her future is, or just like overall like override everything about her personality to try to turn her into like a pet or an accessory. Again, I know that it sounds so wishy-washy that my answers always come down to like have a sense of proportion, but I do think that when you try to, write a perfect design for the universe with no sense of proportion, you end up with something that invariably overrides some crucial aspect of the matter.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a parent, so I'm gonna take some lines from my own father here, where, well, he said the thing about kids is that they grow up to be adults, right? You
Yeah.
can't, right? And like that's kind of the point, right? You don't want to raise a kid to belong to you forever because they're not gonna belong to you forever,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
They're gonna become their own person. That's the idea. Is that like that's what you're trying to like make them into, is their own human being with rights over their own life. And so you have to have, respect
Yeah.
for, the fact that, yeah, they're good. They're going to get to choose their own life one day. right? And you can't be imposing your idea of the good life or what they ought to be or what you think they ought to be or like what your self-conception of yourself requires them to be. Um, because they're just, they're not your property.
Yeah,
Fundamentally, they're their own property. That's
exactly. You are being given the privilege of helping someone at a really vulnerable moment in their life. And if you do it right, you might provide them with help that they will be using for the rest of their lives. And if you do it wrong, you could really screw up their life. And you should be operating. That's kind of what I try to do. Since I always write things about my family and make everybody mad because I wasn't supposed to like write that on the internet for people to see it. Like that's what I try to do with my own kid is just be like, there's a book coming. There's a tell-all memoir about what I was like as a parent and what do I want to be in this chapter. Like, what am I prepared to have recorded for history's eyes in this interaction with you right now, right? Like, so yeah, you have to treat them with an eye to the adults they will one day become, and and recognize that you're being given a really rare gift, a really rare opportunity to be with someone at a formative moment and to be the person they trust, to hopefully earn that trust, you know?
yeah. I think that's a good note to wrap up on. This, as you say, ambivalence. Right. That yeah. In some things, I think there are pretty clear answers, and some things, yeah, it's right to be a little bit ambivalent.
Yeah.
Right. To maybe not have all the bright lines in the world ready to go, but to sit with some of the harder problems. So yeah, thanks so much for coming on and wrestling with some of these hard problems of feminism, about where we are and where we're going. Any
No,
last words?
no, this was a lovely conversation, and I hope I actually managed to make a point at some point in the middle of it. I felt a point coming very close to me. It may have evaded.
I think many points were made. Many points. So yeah, Jude Doyle, author of the forthcoming DILF, the train wreck, Dead Blondes, Bad Mothers, um, many other useful and exciting articles that you can read on the internet. So yeah, thanks for coming on, and I will see you all around.